U.S. President Donald Trump has just made an emergency statement announcing that an American delegation is now heading to Islamabad to continue negotiations with Iran, but he stated that there is no hope for a peace agreement at this time. Moreover, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance did not go to these negotiations, and the war in the Middle East is flaring up again. U.S. President Trump convened an emergency meeting in the White House Situation Room the day before to discuss the renewed crisis around the Hormuz Strait and negotiations with Iran. And insiders noticed how high-ranking military officials were leaving the White House the day before without any comments, which indicates that the meeting was entirely behind closed doors. In addition to them, all officials responsible for both the military and economic aspects of this war participated in the meeting. And it's important to note that exactly the same emergency meeting with exactly the same participants took place at the White House just a day before the start of the US and Israel war against Iran on February 28. Immediately after this meeting, the U.S. Department of the Treasury extended the suspension of sanctions against Russian oil, and that says a lot. Well, and the U.S. military moved on to seizing tankers. And all this is happening against the backdrop of the ceasefire period ending on April 21. And today, Trump publicly accused Iran of a very serious violation of the ceasefire and stated that the Iranians acted very harshly. Well, in addition, Iran in turn strongly denies all of Trump's statements about the concessions that Tehran allegedly agreed to. It points out that hostilities may resume in the near future if there are no concessions from Iran in Islamabad. Let's discuss this topic together. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. And if you consider the work of this channel important and necessary, you can support this channel with your donation or sponsorship. How to do this? All the links and details are in the description of this video or via the QR code on your screens. So, the war in the Middle East is entering a hot phase again after 2 weeks of ceasefire. It is known that Iran has once again closed the Hormuz Strait and even opened fire on a tanker passing through the strait. But there are much more important signs that the White House has decided to move to a new phase of the war. Well, I'll start with the fact that Donald Trump stated today that Iran has committed a serious violation of the ceasefire regime. Nevertheless, Trump expressed confidence that a peace agreement with Tehran will still be reached, and he stated, quote, "This will happen either the easy way or the hard way." Then Trump announced that American representatives are heading to Islamabad and will arrive there tomorrow evening for negotiations. But Trump's rhetoric in this regard sounds very, very harsh. And to put it very briefly, he said that, well, this is kind of the last chance for some sort of deal, which he himself doesn't really believe in. And he says, "We will force them to accept the terms we originally set." Well, it's worth noting that only Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner went to Islamabad. But US Vice President J.D. Vance will not go to Islamabad for the talks on Iran. Why? Because the Secret Service was unable to ensure the Vice President's safety in time for the 24th. So they decided that he simply won't go there. In turn, the spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry, Esmail Baghai, called the US blockade of Iranian ports illegal and criminal. This shows that Iran is also not going to make any concessions there. Here's another interesting point that I want to discuss with you. The day before, it was noticed that the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, was seen leaving the White House. Moreover, he left the White House without any comments for the press, and it's obvious that they tried to keep this visit secret, but journalists still noticed it. After Dan Kane's secretive White House visit, it was revealed he attended a closed meeting. In a meeting in the Situation Room together with other high-ranking members of Donald Trump's administration. It turned out that on Saturday, US President Donald Trump convened a meeting in the White House Situation Room to discuss the renewed crisis around the Hormuz Strait and negotiations with Iran. And so sources eventually admitted that yes, the situation with Iran is at a critical point. The ceasefire agreement is expected to expire in just 3 days. And the final date for the new meeting between American and Iranian negotiators has been postponed for several days. And despite the fact that the American delegation is flying to Islamabad, there are no signs that these negotiations will lead to anything, because both sides are signaling that they do not agree to the conditions set by their counterparts. But Iran's behavior shows that they are not ready for the deal that Trump has already been boasting about. Well, for example, Iran has reinstated strict military control. They have taken control over the Hormuz Strait, prohibiting the free passage of commercial ships. The reason was the naval blockade by the United States of America. This was stated by the official representative of the Central Command of the Islamic Republic, Khatam al-Anbiya, Ebrahim Salfagari. And here is his quote. The Americans, with their history of numerous violations of obligations, continue piracy and maritime robbery under the guise of the so-called blockade. In this regard, control over the Hormuz Strait has been returned to its previous state. The regime will remain in effect until the US stops blockading Iranian ports. But the US obviously has no intention of ending its blockade. And in response to the Iranian statement, the US announced that in the coming days, American troops will begin boarding and seizing oil tankers and merchant ships connected to Iran in international waters. The decision of the administration of US President Donald Trump is to increase economic pressure on Tehran. According to the Wall Street Journal, this is aimed at forcing the Iranian regime to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and make concessions regarding its nuclear program. But that's not all. The official representative of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that same Esmail Baghaei, whom we already mentioned today, stated that Iran has never discussed handing over its enriched uranium to the Americans. This is contrary to what Donald Trump previously claimed. He emphasized that such an option is not even being considered. Quote, "Enriched uranium is as sacred to us as the land of Iran, and it will not be handed over anywhere or under any circumstances." Thus, he refuted the statement of US President Donald Trump, who claimed that Iran had agreed to hand over enriched uranium from the facilities in Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow to the Americans. Thus, he refuted the statement. The head of the White House said he was going to extract the material from under the rubble with excavators and take it all to the US, while Tehran supposedly would get nothing in return. Who claimed that it was a $20 billion deal. Both sides also noted that the media reports about Iran's readiness and agreement to hand over enriched uranium from the facilities in Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow. However, Tehran will continue to adhere to its principles on this matter. Thus, the nuclear issue is not only unresolved, it remains at the same level as it was before the war. The president's statement said that Iran agreed to resume the closure of the strait, as well as about numerous attacks on vessels and facilities in this waterway. It came less than 24 hours after Trump stated that a deal to end the war could be reached within 1 or 2 days. The White House stated that if a breakthrough does not happen soon, the war could resume in the near future. He said this at a meeting of the White House task force. The statement by US President Donald claimed that he was supposed to take part specifically in the next round of negotiations with Iraq. He agreed with the Americans. In addition, the guest was Secretary Marco Rubio, the Minister of Defense, Isfahan, Fordow, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. The head of the White House administration, Susie Wiles, also attended the meeting. The special patriot thus refuted Donald Trump, who claimed that the Americans enriched the facilities, General Dan Kane. And what's interesting is that the White House isn't commenting on this meeting at all. Moreover, if it hadn't been for someone accidentally noticing someone leaving, and it wouldn't have come to light. So it's obvious that they were trying to keep this meeting in the White House Situation Room secret. Thus, he refuted President Trump's statement, who claimed that he agreed on the eve of the war and agreed. The same Situation Room. Interestingly, on Saturday, speaking to journalists enriched from the Natanz facilities, he joked a little they wanted to block the strait again, and later added that Iran, quote, will not be able to blackmail us. This way he refuted the Iranians. It is also important that Trump said on Saturday evening that Iran had agreed to hand over the enriched material to the Americans. But by the next day, there were still no new comments from the White House. Natanz thus refuted President Donald Trump's statement that they were still headed to Islamabad for talks, which obviously there is no longer much hope for. And it's also important to note that Trump agreed and took some precautions. The Americans have enriched Isfahan and have a license to sell Russian oil and petroleum products that were already loaded onto tankers as of April 17. And importantly, the U.S. Treasury Department urgently reported this right after the meeting at the White House. Just a day earlier, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that Washington would not extend the lifting of sanctions against Russian oil since there is no longer a need, contradicting Trump, who agreed that the world does not need oil. And then suddenly Bessent changed his mind and renewed it all the way through May 16th. So there's definitely something to think about here. Natanz and Fordau. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments. So, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechenu. The link is in the description of this video. And if you refute the statement of the president of the YouTube channel, I will be grateful to you for that. This can be done with a donation, for example, on Patreon. All links and details are in the description of this video. Natanz Fordo. Goodbye, everyone.